Welcome to the Tarot Today Live show, Kris Waldherr. Thank you so much for coming today to spend some time with us to talk about your new book, Unnatural Creatures.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be here, Mary. It's such a thrill. It really is.
Well, and it's a perfect time too, because this is a great book for Halloween.
Yeah, I think that when you think of Halloween, one of the things that comes to mind are what are the great horror stories, and one of them is definitely Frankenstein. But I like to say that with Unnatural Creatures, I've taken a more humanist approach. It's a retelling of Frankenstein from the point of view of the three women closest to Victor Frankenstein: his mother Caroline, his bride to be Elizabeth, and his servant Justine. Um, it's hard to avoid these sort of phrases when you're talking about Frankenstein, but I like to say that a natural creature shocks new life into Mary Shelley's masterpiece. It's revealed by revealing the feminine side of the tale. I mean, it's like everywhere. It's like it's alive, it's electrifying, it shocks.
Right.
Um, but I'm thrilled that so far it's getting really wonderful reception. It's a editor's choice over at the Historical Novel Review. Forward reviews really loved it, and it's got like a something like an absurd like 4.9 rating on Amazon, which shocks me because usually on Amazon they're immediately like ready to do whatever they can to bring a balanced view to reviews. So I'm just really pleased that people are loving it. And it's available, and it's in paperback, ebook, audio, as well as hardcover. So I wanted to make sure that it was accessible to everybody in whatever format they prefer.
Oh, I love that because I downloaded it to my Kindle. I just love doing
Perfect.
that.
Yeah, I have to say that I love reading on my Kindle too, especially good at night when you're sort of getting ready to go to sleep.
Well, it's so funny because that's the that's the thing now is like it takes up digital space, right? But it doesn't take up as much bookshelf space, and that was something that that I'm sure
Yeah.
contact with too. As a writer, you must also be quite an avid reader. Was there?
I am. Yeah, I read a lot, and I read really quickly too. But what's interesting is that I've had a number of people who purchased it as ebook and audiobook, and they liked it so much that they went and they purchased the hardcover because they wanted something collectible. And so that makes me really happy that they're thinking like, oh yes, I'm going to read this again. But yeah, I read a lot. I read a lot of different genres, and depending on what I'm working on, I seem to go between either I'm always reading nonfiction or I'm always reading fiction. Because when I'm writing fiction, it's hard for me to read fiction. So that's usually when I do the research. And it's just like, I love having so many books accessible to me as ebooks. It's just such a wonderful, wonderful cornucopia of wealth, if you will, of literary goodness.
Oh, totally. And I wanted to ask you about the research because even I started reading the book, and just chapter one, even just at the start of the book, you can tell that it's well researched. Things that I didn't know, like about what are they called, is it in Switzerland? They're like magistrates, the
The
syndics.
syndics, yeah, yeah. Well, what's interesting is that during the time that Frankenstein takes place, it's the late 18th century, which coincides with the French Revolution as well. And at that time, Geneva was a city republic. It wasn't part of Switzerland yet. And I hadn't realized that until I did my deep dive with research. And thank you, Mary, for mentioning that, because I did spend a lot of time researching it. And I went to Geneva and I did all sorts of travels and things. But it's mentioned one of the first lines in Frankenstein, and Victor Frankenstein's narrative, as he says, I'm at birth a Genevan and my father has been a syndic. There have been syndics in my family for generations. And I wondered, what is a syndic? And so I researched it. And it turns out that they were magistrates, like judges in a way, but they were also considered the aristocracy of Geneva, kind of like the rulers, even though it was a republic. So it wasn't like they had a king or a queen. They had these syndics who would come together in a council and rule. So that was really something different than I expected. It was fascinating to find out.
Yeah, how much, how long did it take to write this book? I mean, and I mean, like researching everything and, start to finish. What's the journey like?
It's about 3 years, and that seems to be pretty average for these sort of books. Like when I wrote my first novel, The Lost History of Dreams, that also took me about 3 years. But bear in mind that I'm working on other things as I go along. And there's also pauses where, you're waiting for feedback from your agent or your editor or your beta readers. Um, but it is a process like that. Usually I do a lot of the research up front, just because the more I know, the easier it is for me to write. And then inevitably after I finish a draft, I usually have to do even more research because I realize where I'm lacking certain pieces of information. But I really love it. It's easy. We call it, people who write historical fiction, we call it going down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Because, you go in for one piece of information, next thing you know, you're researching what were towels made of in 1790 Geneva. It gets to be really obsessive.
Oh, that's so fascinating though. And I love, if it's a novel, I love historical novels. I've loved those since I was a kid. I was really into like historical romances by Jude Deveraux and
I love those too. I love historical romances. During the pandemic, that was what I mainly read. They were just so
where you
comforting.
right away to a different time and place, and that's what is so great is that you did the research that you did, because that really helps us get into it. That creates the imagery. We can get a sense of what things look like, and what the setting was. So just, I appreciate that as a reader when somebody.
Oh, well, makes me happy to hear. Well, that's kind of what we call, there's a term for that, they call it the world building, like how is the world building in a novel? And that happens also a lot with fantasy novels. Like there's a lot of world building involved because the more immersive the world is, the more, to my mind anyway, the satisfying it is to read.
Why
It
was
just
it?
brings you to another place and time.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And why was it important for you to tell like the feminist side of the story? Because we'd never think about the women associated with Frankenstein, because nobody really tells us about it.
Well, to be fair, there are several novels about Elizabeth, Victor's bride, and there's some really wonderful ones. One that comes to mind off the top of my head, it's called The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Lavenza by Kirsten White, and that came out in 2018, which was the bicentennial of the first publication of Frankenstein in 1818. Um, but I was really interested in how did these three women shape Victor, and how were they shaped by the choices he made? And it's interesting because even though Frankenstein was written by an 18-year-old teenage girl, I mean that's what Mary Shelley was at that time. It's actually a very masculine novel when you think about it.
Mm.
Those who've read it are often surprised to find that it's made up of three narratives, masculine narratives. The first is this Arctic explorer named Robert Walton. The second is Victor Frankenstein, which of course is the one that everybody thinks of. There's like the scientist up in his attic and the lightning and it lives and all of that. And the third, which to my mind is the most effective narrative, is of the creature that Victor creates, who is nameless throughout. So the women are only presented through Victor's point of view, and they're very kind of thinly written. For example, it's always like Victor, he really much idealizes them. And I realize it's because that they are his projection. And so he's not really seeing them for who they are. So I've long loved Frankenstein. It's one of my three favorite novels. And I just always really wanted to do this. I thought about it from the first time I read Frankenstein as a 12-year-old. I was always interested, like, what about the women's side of the story? So that's what I've tried to do.
I love that. I love that. And how much did you dig into the Shelleys? Like I was a big fan of Percy Shelley growing up. I have a copy of Prometheus Unbound that is half in Polish, half in English, like page to page, like a translation.
Oh, that's
That
amazing.
I-
I would love to see that. I did a lot of digging into Mary Shelley's life and also her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, because ultimately, I think of Frankenstein as a book about bad parenting and what happens when you don't take responsibility for those that you bring into the world. And maybe, I mean, I didn't feel like this when I first read it as a 12-year-old. It was just this incredibly great horror novel. And of course, we know the main themes are about, the scientific hubris of Victor Frankenstein. What does it mean to play God, if you will, in this world? And all of the ethics of that. I mean, in some ways, my friend Alyssa Palumbo always likes to say that Victor Frankenstein is the ultimate tech bro. And I think there's a certain amount of truth to that. But what struck me rereading Frankenstein, especially once I had a child of my own, was how many orphans and examples of bad parenting there are in the novel, besides the most obvious one, which is Victor Frankenstein, who creates this creature and then abandons him into the world, and he wreaks havoc. So that was kind of the point of view where I was coming from. Circling back to Mary Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Wollstonecraft died 11 days after Mary Shelley was born. And so she never knew her mother save through the writings of her mother. So that was fascinating to me. And her father, William Godwin, they were very close until her father remarried. And Mary Shelley didn't get along very well with her stepmother. So there's like bad parenting number one. And for whatever reason, there was a definite distance placed between Mary and her father. And then later, when Mary eloped with Percy Shelley when she was only 16, her father basically disowned her. And much of Mary Shelley's writings, I think, were an attempt to kind of reconnect with her father, which eventually they did when she and Shelley were able to marry after the death of his first wife. But it's
yeah.
something that I think it's really there in that story. Like Mary Shelley is saying, like, I've been abandoned by my parents just as this monster has been. And am I a monster because I've been abandoned?
Wow. Wow, that is a really interesting take on it. And it really is like a great novel for this time of year. Is there any, was that intentional? Because I always think, books a lot often are like movies. You never know the environment it's going to be released into. Sometimes it's really hard to get the time slot that you want it to come out in. This seemed to kind of work perfectly for you.
Well, I did choose the October publication date because I independently published it, and this was a choice I made. I was just ready to try something different after 30 years of traditional publishing. And I could see so clearly how to market unnatural creatures, that I just kind of felt like it was time to try this. And with the pandemic, there wasn't a lot going on with traditional publishing. So with my agent's blessing, I decided to do this because I didn't really want to wait until after the pandemic to see if it was possible to place it in a more advantageous situation. So, I thought to myself, well, I know it's going to take me about a year to publish this book in the way that I want to. And bear in mind that I worked for 7 years at Penguin Books. I have a lot of publishing experience. And when people say self-publishing, you're not self-publishing really. It's self-directed, meaning that you're getting all these people to help you and you have your vision, but you can't do it alone. And I've been incredibly fortunate to have some immensely talented and generous people, lending their talents to help me bring this book into the world.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Is Halloween a special time of the year for you? What do you like to do? How do you
Oh, of course, it's my favorite holiday. How could it not be? Well, also, I also love Easter too, just because I love spring. Well, I am very fortunate that I live in Brooklyn in a neighborhood that is known for having the best house for Halloween. And we live in the neighborhood is called Ditmas Park, and it has these amazing, huge Victorian houses with porches. So everybody dresses up their house with spider webs and automatic robots, and it's really, really wild. So we have all of these tourists who come just to kind of wander around. I don't know if you know about the Diker lights at Christmas, where everybody goes to Diker Heights to see all of these Christmas lights. Well, everybody comes to Ditmas Park for Halloween. So there's two Halloween parades, not one, but two, where they have these like, you know, they have like a band and they have these huge puppets and, you know, people walking on stilts, and it's really a huge celebration. So I love it. I love it. I really, really do.
That sounds fantastic. And for our tarot audience, our tarot peeps out there, they're probably most familiar with you because of your tarot decks that you put out. I have two of them, the Goddess Tarot and the Lover's Path Tarot. And I have to say, I've had these for years and I treasure them. And you know, here's the thing that I thought about last night when I was just kind of looking through those decks in preparation to talk to you. And it's like they have never gone out of style, you know, and yet from the time that you publish them in even like in a short time span, the tarot deck market has exploded in so many different directions and changed so much, and everybody's putting out a deck here and there, and they're putting them on GoFundMe or whatever. They're it's nuts trying to keep up with it. What's your point of view on this? What kind of changes have you noticed in the world of tarot deck creation, and what impresses you, and what do you think? I don't know that that's a good change.
Well, I think you make a very good point about the crowdfunding that has become huge with tarot, and it is hard to keep on top of it. And there's some really, really beautiful decks being created. I have, you know, no criticism, and I'm thrilled to see them get out there in the world. I think what's hard though is that when you have so many decks, it's much harder to see them kind of break out in the way that the Goddess Tarot and the Lover's Path Tarot did for me, because I was fortunate that they were brought out at a time where there wasn't all this crowdfunding and self-publishing, and I'm really grateful that they're still in print. So but I was just saying, because I teach tarot to writers and creatives, and I was just saying, you know, anything you can think of, there is a tarot deck. Because I teach using the Rider Waite, because I feel like that's kind of like round zero for
Yeah.
modern tarot decks, because you know it has the illustrated pips and such, um and on one hand I applaud that, and on the other hand I also think like, well, how much influence can you really have on the market? I think it's harder for creators in that way. At the same time, though, there are opportunities that there weren't years ago. It was either, you know, find a publisher or you're kind of out of luck. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I can tell you some decks that I also work with that I really love.
Yeah.
And I always like to say that when you're working with a tarot deck, it's like visiting with a friend, because they each have different voices.
Mm.
And so depending on what's going on, I mean, I love, of course, my Goddess Tarot, which is another very feminine deck about trying to kind of recapture women's stories. The same way with Unnatural Creatures, I was trying to recapture these women's stories of the Frankenstein. And it's just a very like nurturing and calm deck. And I think it's a great deck for people who are starting out. And I kind of designed it that way that, you know, it has the borders and stuff, and it's meant to be very accessible. But beyond my decks, I really love the Gaian Tarot
Mm.
by, oh, I'm spacing on her last name, by Joanna. Oh, forgive me. And she's a friend of mine too. Because I find that it has the most beautiful pips I've ever seen. It's just such a stunning deck. And what else? I worked with, when I was at School of Visual Arts, I studied with David Palladini, who created the Aquarian deck,
Oh,
which
wow.
was my first deck that I learned on. Yeah. And there's also another deck that I find is really, really interesting, and it's not super popular. But when I was learning the tarot, I found it to be very useful. And it is a deck that is pips only. That, of course, I'm spacing. I should just go get my box of decks over not being very useful here. But the Gaia Tarot is one that I just always go to, that is just really, really comforting. But there, I also really love the decks of Lisa Hunt, who's a friend of mine, and I'm amazed at how incredibly prolific she is. And
Yeah.
if you're talking about a deck for the season, I would say her Ghosts and Spirits Tarot is really nice and spooky.
Yeah.
It may
That's a
not be something you want to read with every day, but I think it's just really like, if you want to go like deeper with your ancestral questions, I think it's great for that.
Yeah, I think it's great for that. And also, like mediumship readings too. I recommended that this.
Yes, I was going to say that I could really see that for mediumship readings. Yeah. Yeah. When you just want to kind of channel information from another realm.
Yeah, and it is spooky. It is a spooky
It's
deck.
very spooky, but it's also very beautiful too. She's just
Yeah,
such a gifted
of course.
watercolorist. And she's one of the few people who is actually working not just digitally. Like I think another thing that's happened is that with digital art, it makes it more accessible for lots of people to create it. And there's a lot of skill involved, but it's a little different than when you're working with the physicalities of paint. It's just a different thing. Not better or worse, just different.
Yeah, it is different. And it is kind of a thing. And I was talking to, I think I was talking to Chiro about the whole AI thing now that is happening and how there's,
Yeah, yeah. He's done a lot of decks too. Yeah.
but we were just talking about how, people are now starting to kind of look into it. It's like, oh, could I create a deck and how that can change? Uh,
Yeah, but I always like to say just because you know how to use a Photoshop doesn't make you necessarily an artist. You still have to have the eye and the skill and stuff. And but on the other hand, I'm also glad that it's making it accessible for people who maybe don't want to sit there and futz around with oil paints and things.
yeah, I like the futzing. I like the
I do too. I do too. I like the futzing. Yeah.
well, you mentioned like using tarot to teach writers. And, you know, I find that is so fascinating because I think like three cards gives you a sentence. It could give you a whole story, a beginning, middle, and end. And
Absolutely.
can you talk about like how, for some of our listeners, I know we have a lot of writers, that listen to the show and are members of the guild and stuff. What are maybe just a couple ways that they can use tarot to help with their writing if if they're writing a scene or a chapter and they get kind of stuck on like what the character could be doing or feeling?
Well, I think the one thing that I always tell my students is that when you do have that kind of writer's block, there's usually a few things going on. Usually you are just trying too hard, that you're just so overwhelmed. The other thing that's going on is also that sometimes you're just tired. But the third thing, and this is what tarot can help you with, is that you need to have your point of view. So I encourage them to do something what I call having a conversation with the cards, where you ask the cards a question. And it's the most basic way to work with a tarot, that you can ask them, like, why is this character giving me a hard time in this particular scene? Pull a card, see what the cards have to say. Then from there, ask another question. What about if I try it this way? Take another card and just kind of like get a dialogue going
Yeah.
and be open to what it has to say. And if you do have some resistance to what the cards are saying to you, that's something to explore as well. And you could free write on it or whatever. So those are things that are very, very simple and very accessible tools if you're feeling blocked with tarot. I also really, really love using the tarot for creating characters. I have what I call these certain cards in the major arcana as well as in the minors. I call them character archetype cards, that you can use them to kind of build a character, and to explore ones that you already have underway, that you can kind of think about a character you're writing and then take out the tarot, see what tarot card you can associate with them, and use that to go deeper and to free write, to meditate even, and just to kind of ask the deck, like, what do I need to know? How can I deepen this character, and pull cards? Like, make it a real process where you're just having a conversation, a dialogue, and see what the cards have to say. They usually have a lot.
Yeah, I love that too. And is it it- like the writers that you work with in this way, are they already tarot people? Are they already familiar with it? Or is this like maybe the first introduction for some of them? And how comfortable do they get?
Well, I like to say that by the end of the class, they're very comfortable. At least that's my intention. If they're not comfortable, they haven't told me. And I kind of like, I hope they're comfortable, because I really try to meet them on their level. And I've had people who've never picked up a tarot deck to people who are incredibly familiar with the tarot and work with it every day. And so I always feel that my job as a teacher is to see what they needed to meet them on their level.
I love-
before I always get into teaching a class, I always do a survey of like, where are you? What are you working on? How can I help you? Because even though they're coming to my class and there's a certain curriculum that I've developed over the, years that I've been teaching this class, everybody has different needs. And as writers, they're in different places. Like I'm started teaching a tarot for fiction writers class last night, and I have everybody from people who've written several novels to somebody who is just starting to write, and she's interested in recording her family history,
Mm,
to somebody who writes songs and poems, which are a different form of storytelling. I think that's the thing that connects it all, is that all of these are forms of storytelling, and tarot is perfect for that,
yeah.
because tarot is really built with story cycles. You look at the major arcanas and it's the hero or heroine's return, the universal story, and then you look at the minors and it's more about the details of life, but different aspects of them.
Yeah, and that's the one thing, the storytelling in both of those decks, because you share the mythology and you give us the background, and we get a sense of, like, who you base the art on, or just the archetypes of it. Did you, and you're a novelist as well, were you always a storyteller? Like, when did that start?
I yeah, it took me a while. It's a great question, Mary. It took me a while to realize that, and I think it was when I started writing fiction in 2009. Um, because I began as a children's book illustrator, and part of my reason for that was it was kind of a random thing, because I always wrote, I always illustrated, and I was always interested in tarot too. I can remember the first time I saw a deck, I must have been like 9 years or even younger years old, and I just was drawn to them. Um, but the reason I ended up becoming a book illustrator was because I got a scholarship to art school, and I thought, oh, I must be meant to be an artist. So I focused on art, and eventually I began writing again. And then with working with the tarot, I thought, well, what is that connects all of these? And it's that they're all forms of storytelling. And I love that I can tell a story with art or with tarot or with my words, whether it be through nonfiction or in a novel.
Is there is there a certain, how, when you have a story that you want to tell, or you're inspired by something, how do you know what form it should take? Whether it should take a visual form, like a card, or just an artwork, or whether it's a story to write out. Is there a difference? How do you decide how you're going to express this inspiration that you get?
That is another great question. It usually comes to me, I can kind of see it in my mind from the beginning, which is useful for helping me figure out how to approach something. Because sometimes with my illustrated books, it's very, very clear, and sometimes I dream about them. But with my novels, it's more a response to something I want to communicate. Like with Unnatural Creatures, it was about bringing to life the women's point of view in Frankenstein. With my debut novel, The Lost History of Dreams, which is also a Gothic novel, but it's pretty different. It was really about doing this kind of Bronte-esque take on the Orpheus myth, which I've always really loved, and has moved me very deep throughout my life. But the initial impetus was that was a dream in which I dreamt about a man and a woman dressed in mid 19th century clothing. And I knew it was mid 19th century because the woman was wearing a crinoline, not a bustle, because if it was a bustle, it would have been like 1880 or 1890. And they were arguing in this room that was lit only by a fireplace over an inheritance. And I had no idea what was going on. It was like I was dropped into another time and place, like the scene. So I woke up and I wrote it down, and the novel was really about trying to figure out what were they arguing about and what were the stakes. And it eventually morphed into combining my interest in the Brontes and the Orpheus and Eurydice, as well as my interest in Victorian mourning customs, because my mother-in-law had recently died. And she was somebody that I loved very, very much. She was kind of like this, somebody once said, after she died, that she was somebody who embodied the living, it was a living embodiment of kindness. That's what Joyce was. So, and it was a surprise. We weren't prepared for her passing. So it was the morning that overtook me was just so intense that I had found myself researching these Victorian morning rituals, which was a way for them to give order to these emotions. And that affected the lost history of dreams, because I ended up using my protagonist was a postmortem photographer who had suffered a loss of his own. And how do you deal with such a loss? How do you forgive yourself if you feel that in some way you didn't see the signs or whatever? And
Yeah.
so it was kind of part of the process.
Wow. I bet so. Is that, here's just a weird question that I've always wondered, but have you heard of morning jewelry?
Oh,
Is
yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And I wrote about that a little bit in Lost History of Dreams. Yeah. I mean, they would use hair, they would use jet, and there were certain clothing you would wear depending. For example, if you were in deep mourning, it was black and it had to be lusterless black. It was like bombazine, like it couldn't be shiny or anything. And then if you were in half mourning, you were allowed to wear lavender, but it was a way to signal to the world, I'm in pain and I've lost somebody, so please be gentle and kind to me. And I kind of wish that we had that today. Except living in New York City, everybody wears black, so how would we know, right?
right. I have a friend in Los Angeles that collects morning jewelry, like old stuff. And it seemed to me that was maybe something that came from Victorian times. And
Yeah, 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 very much so. Yeah.
because it looks Victorian, a lot of the older antique jewelry and stuff. But
And
any
they're beautiful. They're beautiful
they are,
pieces. Yeah.
they're absolutely gorgeous. And I don't know. I think, in some ways, I think that's fitting that they are, because mourning, I think, in a lot of ways, as painful as it is kind of a beautiful human process that we can all sort of understand, even from diverse cultures. We can understand that sense of loss. But you know,
Mhm.
I digress. As I
Well,
said,
it's an interesting digression, and I think what you said about grief is really true. I mean, it's really a marker how much you love somebody,
yeah,
that the grief you feel.
absolutely, absolutely, it is, and it's a universal thing. So
Yeah.
often, we think, how can we relate to each other? But Frankenstein is a universal thing too, when you think about
It
it.
absolutely is, and I think that people connect to the story. There's multiple levels. I mean, it's certainly like part of us. It's just a great yarn. Mary Shelley is a great storyteller. There's so many twists and turns. And I have to say, reading it the first time, I had no idea what was going to happen. And I was absolutely flabbergasted at some of the plot twists that, some people may know, some people may not, who are listening on your podcast. So I don't want to spoil it. Read Frankenstein. I feel like I'm a Frankenstein evangelicalist. Um, and it starts in the Arctic, and then you go back to Geneva, and then there's this chase through all of these countries. It's just really, really wonderful. But I also think too, going back to spooky season, it's like Victor's monster is like the dark side of us in a way. If we weren't nurtured by our parents, we were rejected by our parents, what would we be in the world?
Yeah.
And it's just sort of a reminder of that. And it's funny, a good friend of mine, when I was researching Frankenstein, she was incredibly helpful, and she teaches Frankenstein a lot, as part of literature of technology class that she gives. And she said usually when people read Frankenstein, there's two schools of thought. One is hashtag Team Monster, that they're very sympathetic to the monster because he's been abandoned, even though he does all these different things. The other one is hashtag pox on both their houses, because Victor is totally irresponsible and, again, ultimate tech bro, and doesn't really consider about the monster, but also the monster does bad things too. And I have to say, I am more Team Monster.
Yeah. I'm Team Monster too. But
Yeah.
it's kind of funny, because it's like people take that tale and relate it to technology today, AI today,
Yep.
all of the
Absolutely. Like Frankenfruit, all that stuff. And
oh,
yeah,
food.
Frank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah,
So
it's just astonishing, especially when you consider that Mary Shelley was only 18 years old and she created this whole genre of science fiction and horror.
yeah.
It's just, I mean, it's a gothic novel, but I think it was just, I feel such a great debt to her for this, as well as admiration and astonishment. I think back to myself as an 18-year-old, and I was just, trying to get to college.
Yeah, I joined
Not
the
writing a
army at
masterpiece.
16.
You joined the army, so there you
Yeah,
go. Yeah, yeah.
I was not creating a whole kind of world. I was just like getting sucked into one, kind of. But thank you so much for taking the time. And everybody, go get your own copy of whatever format you want, because it's available in all the different formats, of Unnatural Creatures by Kris Waldherr. And also, if you haven't checked out the Goddess Tarot, the Lover's Path Tarot, you need to get those decks as well. I need to do I need to like do a walkthrough of those decks so people can see what they're missing if they haven't gotten them, because they're just gorgeous. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you. Oh, it's such my pleasure. Thank you so much, Mary, and I love chatting with you. Thank you.
This was great. This was great. Happy Halloween.
Thank you. Happy Halloween. Ciao.
Ciao. Okay, so I'm gonna stop the recording because that's always